Okay, NFL report. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so our first thing is the New England Patriots versus the Kansas City Chiefs. Okay, so Alex Smith was the leading passer for the Chiefs. 29 for 50, 246 yards, and his average 4.9, one touchdown. Best rusher, Charcandrick West, 17 carries, 61 yards, and he had 3.6 yards per carry, one touchdown. Kansas City, best receiver was Jason Avant, 4 receptions, 69 yards, and his average was 17 and 3/10 yards. His long was 26. Knile Davis was their only person to fumble. Their best defensive player for tackles was Eric Berry, 7 tackles and 6 solo tackles. Kansas City had no interceptions. Knile Davis had 3 returns for 90 yards, and his average was 30, and his long was 34. Frankie Hammond had 2 punt returns for 27 yards, and his average was 13 and 5/10, and his long was 19. Cario Santos, kicking, 2 for 2 on field goals, and his long was 34. Dustin Colquitt was the guy for punting. 3 punts, 107 yards, and his average was 35 and 7/10 yards. His long was 42. We are going to the New England Patriots. The best passer was Tom Brady, 28 for 42. He had 302 yards, and his average was 7 and 2/10. 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. Best rusher for New England was Steven Jackson, 6 carries for 16 yards, and his average was 2 and 7/10. New England's best receiver was Julian Edelman, 10 receptions for 100 yards, and his average was 10. 0 touchdowns, and his long was 14. New England fumbles. The one who fumbled was Dante. The one who recovered a fumble was Dante Hightower. The best tackler for the New England Patriots was Logan Ryan. He had 9 tackles and 8 solo tackles. No interceptions for Patriots. Keshawn Martin had 1 kick return for 26 yards. Danny Amendola had 1 punt return for 22 yards. New England, Stefan Gostkowski had 2 for 2 field goals, 3 for 3 extra points, and Ryan Allen had 126 yards for punting, and his average was 42, and touchbacks is 1. His long was a 43. Trying to get back to the scores. Okay, we're back to the scores, and I gotta go down. Arizona versus Green Bay we're not gonna do the kick returner and all that. I'm just gonna do the normal stuff because people don't really care about the kick returning. Okay, so it was 26-20 Arizona. Okay, Aaron Rodgers was 24 for 44, had 261 yards, and his average was 5 9/10, and he had 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. Eddie Lacy was their best rusher, 12 carries for 89 yards, average was 7 4/10. Their best receiver was Jeff Janis, who had 7 receptions for 145 yards, and his average was 20 7/10, 2 touchdowns, and his long was 60. Green Bay didn't have any fumbles. Clay Matthews was the best tackler of the day. 6 tackles, 5 solo tackles. Green Bay interceptions: Clinton Dix and Marius Davis. No, Demarius Randall, sorry. Going back up. And we are going to Arizona. Okay, Carson Palmer was their best passer. 25 out of 41, 349 yards. And his average was 8 5/10, 3 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. David Johnson had 15 carries for 35 yards, 2 3/10 yards. Best receiver was Larry Fitzgerald, 8 receptions for 176 yards, and his average was 22 yards. His average, 1 touchdown, and his long was 75 in overtime. Arizona fumbles: Carson Palmer, 1 fumble. Arizona's best tackler was Tony Jefferson, 9 tackles and 8 solo tackles. Team's interceptions: Rashad Johnson had 1 interception and 1 yard. Box score. Here we go. I'm sorry, everybody. I'm gonna pause the video right quick. Okay, I'm back, and the best Seattle's passer was Russell Wilson for 366 yards, 31 for 48. Seattle's best rusher was Russell Wilson, 3 carries for 32 yards, and his average was 10 7/10, and his long was 14. Seattle's best receiver was Jermaine Kearse for 11 receptions, 110 yards, and his average was 10 yards, and he had 2 touchdowns, and his long was 17. Seattle had no fumbles, and their best tackler was KJ Wright, who had 14 tackles and 6 solo tackles. No interceptions for Seattle. Cam Newton was 16 for 22 and had 161 yards, and his average was 7 3/10 and 1 touchdown. Jonathan Stewart had 19 carries for 106 yards, 5 6/10 for average, and he had 2 touchdowns, and his long was 59. Carolina's best receiver was Greg Olsen. He had 6 receptions for 77 yards, and his average was 12 8 tenths, and he had 1 touchdown, and he had 27 for his long. Carolina fumbles. Ted Ginn Jr. had 1 fumble. Cameron Artis-Payne had 1 fumble. Best tackler was Luke Kuechly, 11 tackles and 3 solo tackles. Luke Kuechly had 1 interception for 14 yards and 1 touchdown. Cortland Finnegan had 1 interception, no yards, no touchdowns. Sorry, let me pause the video real quick. Okay, the last game that I saw was Denver Broncos versus Steelers, and Denver won 23-16. And Ben Roethlisberger was 24 for 37, and he had 339 yards, and his average was 9 2/10. He had 0 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, and it doesn't say as long, so I'm just going to leave that. Okay, so their best rusher was Martavis Bryant. He had 2 carries for 40 yards, and he had 20 average, and his long was 40. Their best receiver was Martavis Bryant, 9 receptions for 154 yards. Their average was 17 1/10, and his long was 52. Pittsburgh's fumbles: Fitzgerald Townsend, Marcus Wheaton, 1 fumble, lost. 1 loss. Best tackler was William Gay, 8 tackles, 7 solo tackles. No interceptions. And here we go. Denver, here we go. We're going to Denver's stats, and it's so laggy. Who cares? Okay, so Peyton Manning was 21 for 37, and he had 222 yards, and he had 6 yards on average. Denver's best rusher was C.J. Anderson, 15 carries for 72 yards. His average was 4 8/10 and 1 touchdown, and his long was 34. Denver's best receiver was Emmanuel Sanders for 5 receptions, 85 yards, and 17 yards on average, and his long was 34. Denver fumbles. Peyton Manning had 1 fumble, and DeMarcus Ware recovered 1 fumble. Denver's best tackler was Danny Trevathan, 9 tackles and 8 solo tackles. Denver had no interceptions. Bye, everybody, and that was this week's, and stay tuned for the NFC Championship review and the AFC Championship review.